To reconnoiter the position of the two camps, I determined to mount the back of the lion from the valley side. I ran across the open space and climbed halfway up the flank of the great rock, but, finding it was impossible to reach the summit, I selected the tallest pine that grew on the side of the spur and went up it in all haste. When I reached the feathery top, I found myself above the level of the lion's back, swayed by the wind to and from the topmost ledge. Here I had a clear view of the plain, where the savages of both camps were drawn up in two long lines facing each other. The war dance was over, and the time had arrived for single warriors of each side to rush out, and, with wild gestures illustrative of the coming slaughter, to hurl taunts at the other. But my attention was directed more particularly to a scene that was being enacted in the open space of the enclosure on the plateau not 20 yards from me. Ngaraki, who had evidently been unable to quiet the savages on the plain, had found his way into the hostile pa, where he now stood confronting a small band of chiefs, who, by their violent manner and occasional bursts of savage laughter, looked as if they had been drinking waipiro to rouse their utmost ferocity for the coming conflict. The violent chief whom I had seen haranguing them was there, seated upon the ground, while the others stood behind him. His aspect was one of treacherous hatred as Ngaraki, calm and careless, yet a savage of terrible presence, stood before him. Then, before a word was exchanged, the Tohunga of the temple burst forth into his message, delivering it in a half-song, half-speech, while he paced to and fro with dignified mien in the open space. He told them that Hinori had returned, and that he was her messenger. He told them that her word was peace and love, that she had sent him to stop the approaching battle, that, if they fought, they would fight, not for her, but against her. While the yells of mutual defiance came up from the plain like the manifold voice of that god of war who ate his own brothers, Ngaraki's tones resounded within the pa, impassioned and eloquent. But his words would find a heart of peace in the rocks themselves sooner than in the breasts of the savages before him. He ceased, and the violent, blustering chief, whom he had addressed as Amukaria, sprang to his feet. "He says Hinori has come," he yelled, brandishing his axe. "Can he show her to us?" "No, he says she is white as the mountain lily, then we don't want to see her. Hinori is no Wahine Pakeha, she is Maori like ourselves. I have seen her spirit, she is no Pakeha. She bade me collect 1,000 canoes. I have done so, and they will land at Wakata tonight. Curse the Pakeha. A pot for his head. This is my word to him." He turned and, rushing towards an effigy of the white man, which stood at one end of the enclosure, its head already half severed from its body, he struck a furious blow with his axe. The blow completely severed the head, which fell and rolled upon the ground. At this a shout arose from the other chiefs, then Amukaria took the effigy's head in his hand, and holding it up cried, "A pot for the Pakeha's head." Ngaraki stood looking on in silence. Would his fierce blood stand this test? When the chiefs were quiet again, he said calmly, "O Amukaria, your words are wild. Your plans will come to nothing. Those who are to come in the 1,000 canoes are on my side. I have spoken to them and they have listened to my words. They come, but they leave war and knife behind them." A savage yell from Amukaria announced his baffled rage on hearing this. Maddened by drink and lust of blood, he appeared like a demon, with tongue protruded in deadly insult. He danced with rage before Ngaraki, who stood silent, regarding him with his stern black eyes. Verily the spirit of Zun the terrible slumbered within him. A smile of contempt curled his lip, and Amukaria saw it. Unable to contain his fury any longer, he rushed at Ngaraki with axe uplifted, saying, "I will cleave your head as well, and heat the oven for you." The wary chief did not move. He was unarmed, but he had left his outer robe within the mountain, and his limbs were free. For a moment only the axe was poised in the air, but that moment was the last of Ngaraki's most unnatural forbearance with such a foe. His face changed. He would have said anger, but there was not time, so sudden was his spring. He caught the axe by its handle and wrenched it with a sudden twist from Amucaria's hand, then, bounding off a pace, he whirled it far away beyond the palisades of the paw. Before his antagonist could grasp another weapon he had sprung upon him, and in a moment they were locked in a terrible struggle, in which I marked down Amucaria as already a dead man. But as they rocked and swayed in the open space, one of the watching chiefs took a long-bladed knife and threw it carelessly upon the ground a few paces from the combatants. It would have been fair enough if it had been done openly, but the moment chosen was when Amucaria's quick eye alone could notice the act. He had Ngaraki by the hair, but the Ariki had his antagonist by the throat with one hand, and by the wrist with the other. Fully aware that no man could live many minutes with his throat in such a hand as his, he was content to keep his grip and wait. But all the while they were swaying to and fro nearer and nearer to the knife which he had not seen. The other chiefs stood by in silence. They saw their leader's face grow livid, but they knew that he would get the knife. His eyes were starting from his head, and his tongue was lolling, still in insult, from his mouth, but they saw, as I did, that he would reach the knife, and they did not interfere. I drew my revolver, determined to risk a shot at 20 yards if a good chance presented, but I held my hand, thinking that Ngaraki was not the kind of man to need my assistance in a single combat. I would only fire at the last possible moment, but I could warn him, and I thought to do so by shouting at the top of my voice. But my words were lost in the general uproar of savage yells on the plain, and were unheeded. Amucaria was near the knife now. His rolling eyes had marked its position. His fingers slackened from Ngaraki's hair, and mine sought the trigger, while I steadied myself. His body drooped as if he were falling. At that instant, judging by what followed, Ngaraki must have seen the hand which had held him reach out and grasp the haft of the knife. A yell of triumph came from the watching chiefs, but it was quickly silenced. As the knife was grasped firmly in the murderous hand, Ngaraki suddenly let go his fatal grip, then, as the lolling tongue was protruding still further in triumphant insult, his knee came up with a terrific crash against his antagonist's chin. I heard Amucaria's jaws clap together like a trap. It was a death blow. His neck was broken. He fell back like a log and lay there with the lower half of his tongue bitten off by his own teeth. "Anga," said Ngaraki at last, as he picked up his half of the tongue that had insulted him and tossed it to some dogs that were in the enclosure. As he did so the chief sprang upon him unawares, and after a prolonged struggle he was overpowered, and was soon lying bound hand and foot with flaxen thongs. Among these chiefs there was one who urged the others not to kill Ngaraki, but to bind him to the stake on which the headless effigy stood, so that when they returned with the Pakeha's heads they might hold a triumph over him before preparing him for the oven. "Now let us hear you call on Hinori to come and set you free," said one of them, when the deed was done. Their tongues were protruded at him, and they taunted him in a manner that is hard for a Maori chief to bear. But Ngaraki stood in silent contempt, yet his black eyes blazed with wrath, and his flesh quivered with the indignity of his position. He tugged and strained at his bonds, and I saw that if he could but free himself it would be a bad day for his foes. At this time the battle broke with a rattle of musketry and a rising babble of yells on the plain, and the chiefs that were still in the paw hurried down for the fray. The two lines which had been sending out single combatants for some time now fused in one mass, the muskets were cast aside after the first few shots, and the fighting was carried on hand to hand in the grim savage style. In the midst of the throng I could see the gray-haired Te Makawawa fighting fiercely. Even as I singled him out he killed his man, and, whirling his club round his head, raised the savage war-cry, "Waka Ariki!" He and his warriors were now driving the opposing force back against the stronghold. As soon as I saw this an inspiration struck me to liberate Ngaraki, or they would certainly kill him when they were driven back into the paw. In a very few minutes I was down the tree and rushing round the great rock. The fighting was close upon me as I reached the path that led up from the plain, and when I gained the narrow strip of rock in front of the paw I looked back and saw that some of them had turned and were retreating rapidly up the path by which I had come. There was no time to lose. I darted in through the opening left between the palisades and rushed across the open space towards Ngaraki, who seemed to be trying to tear the flesh off his bones in his efforts to free himself and get at the foe. In less than 10 seconds, and just as the foremost Maori entered the pa, the thongs were cut. The chief turned his fiery eyes upon me, said he pakiha, and bounded off to strangle the only foe he could see, the savage who had just entered the pa. Stepping quickly aside from a fierce blow, he seized the unfortunate man by the throat with both hands, lifted him off his feet and shook him like a rat in the air, after which he broke his skull against one of the palisades. Then, picking up the weapon of his foe, a large greenstone near, he turned to the opening of the pa to meet two who were rushing in. Both of them continued their rush into Reina, the abode of spirits, with a clear understanding that they were to leave the door open, for more were coming that way. Ngaraki now stood in the opening and fought grimly against the savages that Te Makawawa and his warriors were driving in. To help him I shot one here and there as occasion demanded, and at last he stood on the narrow strip of rock, an object that struck terror to the hearts of his enemies, for they only faced him as they were compelled by the fierce onslaught of Te Makawawa and his warriors behind. For the most part they were demoralized, and were pushed headlong into the fissure by the press of the throng. Some of the bolder chiefs rushed yelling onto the narrow way, but Ngaraki's terrible club whirled and flashed like green lightning all about him, and they went down. At last one brave fellow sprang forward and closed with Ngaraki, and I had to hold the narrow way myself, but not for long, for, before I had emptied my revolver, I saw bare legs whirling in the air nearby, and in another moment a Maori was hurled into the fissure. It was not Ngaraki, for that fierce Ariki was again standing on the rock, a majestic figure, dealing death. In the side glance that I caught of his flashing eyes and commanding front, I understood what it meant to a Maori to have the blood of the great river of heaven running in his veins. Verily the spirit of Zun the Terrible was awake within him. In the midst of this I saw moving round to the left at the base of the Lion Rock a large band of savages who had not retreated up the path to the pa, but were evidently bent on some other object. They were led by a tall fierce fellow, and I thought I saw the Negro wizard darting to and fro among them. Could they be heading for the opening of the mountain? I fired at a foe who seemed one too many on the narrow strip and looked again. The leader pointed his club towards the mountain, and with a yell pressed forward. At the same instant a rifle shot echoed from high up in the mountain wall, and the savage fell forward on his face. Thank heaven! Kahikatea was on the alert, but if that band got into the mountain, what could 2 men and 2 women do against them? It was with a sickening sensation that I had remembered I had descended by the rope and left it there. Would anyone think to draw it up? Again, I shuddered as I reflected that in all probability the Negro wizard had been into the mountain while we were in the marble cave. Could it have been he that tried to hold the rope when I pulled it up? Filled with apprehension, I noted with one eye that Ngaraki and Te Makawawa's warriors were nearly through their terrible work, and with the other that the band heading round the Lion Rock were in some confusion and hesitation. There was yet time to gain the mountain before the Negro wizard could urge them into the precincts of what many of them regarded as the stronghold of the Tanawa. I knew that in every pa there must be a way of escape by the back, but, failing to find it, I made for the back of the lion, and presently stood on the steep rock near the top of the pine from which I had watched the curtailing of Amukaria's offending tongue. The treetop was 6 feet from me, and a glance to right and left showed me there was no other way down. Every moment was precious if I were to have a hand in guarding the woman I loved from that most subtle tool of the vile ones, the poisoner. Gathering myself together, I sprang as the treetop swayed towards me, and, passing through the feathery pine foliage, found myself clasping the slender top of the stem with arms and legs. For the moment I thought it would break, and there would be an end, but it held good, and I made my way rapidly down the trunk, bruising and scratching myself in my haste. Once on the ground, I sped across the mouth of the valley as fast as my legs would carry me, but I had scarcely gained the bank of the channel when I was overtaken by a Maori running at full speed, with a musket in each hand and a kitful of something heavy round his neck. At first I thought he was an enemy, and I prepared to meet him as such, but when we came face to face on the bank I found to my surprise that it was Tiki. That Tipo was coming to take the little maiden, he said fiercely. Here, Wanaki, lead the way. He handed me one of the muskets and motioned me to proceed. In a very short space of time we were standing inside the opening, and then Tiki disburdened himself of the kit which I found contained a goodly supply of cartridges. While I was filling my coat pockets I heard footsteps coming down the rock from the ledge above, and soon afterwards Kahikadia strode forward into the light, with the sword of the early explorer between his teeth and Gray's rifle in his hand. "Are they coming?" he asked coolly. "Yes, 50 or 60 of them," I said. "Where is she?" "Waiting on the ledge above. But I don't know where Gray and his wife are. I don't think they know anything about this."